So, we're talking about the 1980s now. We just finished the 1970s, which many people consider the golden era of American film, based on the very individualistic, auteur oriented films that, for at least part of the decade, seemed to dominate, or at least dominate our memory of it. So we had, on the one hand, in the 70s, those auteurs like Martin Scorsese and Robert Altman with his revisionist genre movies, as well as a number of others. But then we also had, by the end of the decade, really the resurgence of the blockbuster movie and a model set for what it was that studios really wanted to make. And it wasn't anymore going to be the kind of freewheeling, youth oriented, tour type movies that we saw at the beginning of the decade. It's going to be instead things like Jaws and Star Wars, which really aim to be big, broad entertainment rather than narrow niche audience materials. So, if the 70s was the golden age of American cinema, how then do we remember the 1980s? Well, one thing that we remember about the 1980s, or think about the 1980s, especially how business changed. And a lot of that had to do with Hollywood thinking about movie making as not just movie making anymore, but filmed entertainment, making media, telling stories that are going to be seen in a number of different places. And in the 80s, a key thing that happens is we have non theatrical markets exploding. That means places besides movie theaters, ancillary markets outside of movie theaters, these other side markets like home video, VHS tape sales, and cable television too. Very important non-theatrical market that comes about. So this era of the 1980s is an era where blockbuster movies, increasingly this is what the studios want to make: big, broad, mainstream, crossover, successful, popular entertainment, increasingly with more and more special effects that makes them expensive. But there's also a boom in different kinds of movies, more niche films. The reality of the 80s is that the blockbuster boom, as well as, and especially because of, the rise of ancillary markets, means that there are also a lot of niche films that get produced, particularly by independent producers, and distributed in these, both in theaters and in ancillary markets, because there's just more demand than the major studios can meet. Now, as we said before, the reality is that the excuse me, movie business is always very volatile. Nobody knows what's going to be successful. There's a lot of risks involved in making something, and it's very expensive. But the studios themselves have kind of always been in that kind of crisis mode, but especially after the 1940s. And they become vulnerable to takeovers from companies. In the 60s and 70s, there are a series of big corporate takeovers, resulting in the era of the 70s. If we think about the business side of things, big conglomerates that have lots of different divisions doing different things, swallowing up movie studios and not really knowing anything about making movies. And that approach is not very successful. In the 1980s, those big companies now start to think of themselves as media giants with lots of different related complementary businesses, complementary subsidiaries that can build off of one another and support each other, rather than just being totally separate revenue streams. So in the 1980s, those movie studios that used to be in the business of making, distributing, and exhibiting movies are really now taking and approaching production as being one of the secondary things that they do. And instead, they're financial partners with producers. They are promoters. They know how to promote and market movies and distribute them and get them to theaters as well as these other markets. So this shift towards studios being more about distribution than ever before really fits an era when you have growth in these different markets like cable television and videotape, as well as related areas like music groups that might release soundtrack albums. A good example is Paramount, who was one of our original classic Big Six studios during the classical era. In the mid 60s, they're bought by Gulf and Western, which is originally a petroleum company. And at this point, they really are one of these kind of conglomerates that just has lots of different businesses that really don't make sense interrelated, other than they're doing lots of different things and all expected to make money. That company was restructured as Paramount Communications in the 1980s to be a global media company, and then became part of a even bigger company, Viacom, in the 1990s. Now, most recently, that's kind of changed, and Viacom was split up into different divisions, one of which became Paramount just in 2021 because of Paramount having still this kind of prestigious brand associated with Hollywood. It indeed was the most successful of the studio distributors in the 1980s, with a series of big hits throughout the decade in a variety of genres, with some of the decade's biggest stars like Eddie Murphy, Harrison Ford, etc. Now, the last slide that I'm going to talk about in this particular slideshow helps us see the kinds of numbers that changed in ancillary revenues from the beginning of the 80s until the end of the 80s. And in particular, I draw your attention to home video. This is showing us how much money and how much a percentage of the film industry revenue came from home video. It's very little at the beginning of the decade, a whole lot by the end. Same with pay cable. You look at this, you can just see tremendous changes in what the movie business was in 1980 versus 1990, and that is what's happening across the decade that we're going to be looking at.